Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our webinar today, Invasion of the Body and Mind Data Snatchers. It's a particularly important webinar because, there's all this collection in commerce and our most private information, our health information related to that and all. And, we've got to have some transparency into it if we're the people are to appropriately manage it. And that's why I'm so pleased that we're able to bring this webinar to you. Our moderator today is really an expert in this field of both the medical field and the security and privacy field as well, Alexa McCullough. She's on the board of SecureTheVillage. She's chair of the Los Angeles chapter of Harvard Women in Defense Diplomacy and Development. She's a privacy and cybersecurity entrepreneur. She's a rocket scientist. Like me, she's had a security clearance. She's got one more degree from the University of Michigan than I do. She's got 3 engineering degrees, plus that MBA from Harvard. And if that wasn't enough, she's also got some real expertise in healthcare that she's bringing to us today as moderator. She was a founding partner of Circle Health, a large hospital group based in London. She was on the board of Pacific Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which does groundbreaking stem cell research for rare cancers, has the largest tissue bank on the West Coast, so you can begin to see the privacy implications of that and the privacy knowledge and understanding that Alexa brings to this. And she was also on the board and chair of the risk committee for one of the largest national health service organizations in England, 3 hospitals, 180 different community services, ranging from maternity to hospice care and dentistry to mental health care. I mean, really a broad background, Alexa. So particularly pleased to turn this over to you. I know it's going to be a great webinar. And thanks, Alexa. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being a part of it.
Excellent. Well, with no further ado, we'll just say thanks so much for attending today, folks. We are going to be sharing a recording of the session at the conclusion of this, and we hope that you'll send this out to your list as well. And I'm handing it over to Alexa. Thanks, Alexa.
Thank you so much, Julie, and welcome everyone. I'd like to remind our audience and panelists of the community norms for this webinar. We are nonpartisan. This is meant to be educational for all participants. And this is the start of a bigger conversation on all things privacy and cybersecurity. So we're going to assume the best intentions from everyone. And I want the audience to remember that the panelists, individual panelists, do not represent or speak on behalf of an entire community. So these are our own opinions. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A part, and we'll address them during the last 25 minutes or so. So on that note, I am absolutely delighted to introduce our panelists. Now, Renee Quashie works at the junction where health, technology, law, and policy meet, and was the very first panelist I sought out for this webinar because of his expertise and unique insights into privacy and health data issues. Now, he provides guidance and counsel on key policy, legal and regulatory and technical issues relating to digital health and wellness technology products, services, software, and apps. And that is because today, Renee is the first ever Vice President of Digital Health at the Consumer Technology Association. It's a group representing more than 1,000 member companies from across the entire tech ecosystem. And the Consumer Technology Association is the owner and host of CES, which is the world's most influential trade event and the largest consumer conference in the world. When I say CES, it's the Consumer Electronics Show that happens in Las Vegas every year. He's a former privacy lawyer who received his law degree from the George Washington University Law School. And Renee is so well-versed in healthcare data collection and the adverse effects of its collection, uses, abuses, and breaches. So I am so excited to have Renee, so welcome. Our next panelist is Felix Bustos. Felix is the co-founder and CEO of Helen Health. It's a digital health startup on a mission to ultimately help end cancer through artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, precision nutrition, and preventative health care. The company's long-term vision is to connect the global digital health ecosystem with the best resources available for everyone to live a disease-free life. Now, Felix's company, and you'll see why he's on this panel, collects and ingests a huge amount of personal health information. Now, his company is a first-party data collector that collects healthcare data, epigenetic, which is really behavioral data, information such as fitness, lifestyle, mental health information, etc. And his company has partners who also collect genetic data, places like 23andMe, Gallery, and other FDA-approved partners. Now, because his company ingests so much of this partner data, they actually do it directly from the consumer as opposed to, I think, getting it from the partner company. And they have a roadmap to collect some other data, such as blood test data. So that's why he's on the panel. He's fantastic to be here. Now, by background, Felix was originally an aerospace engineer who became a data scientist. Prior to co-founding Helen Health, Felix spent more than a decade in leadership and senior level positions at Fortune 500 and high-tech startup tech companies, and just name a few: Virgin Galactic, the Spaceship Company, BAE Systems, and Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. Felix is also an awardee of the top 100 Harvard alumni in technology of 2021. So thank you, Felix, for joining us. And our final panelist, but not least, is Sarah Robinson. And when I put together out my feelers for someone who had worked inside big tech, I couldn't have found a better person than Sarah. Sarah is the former global head of trust at Meta, where she oversaw data risk management across all of Meta's companies, including household names, Facebook, Instagram, Oculus, and more than 20 other companies. And so before leaving the company earlier this year, she built a first of its kind code level audit program at Meta to leverage technology to address a public trust deficit there, and to also back up global commitments the company had made to both the public and regulators. So we're excited to have her here. Prior to Meta, Sarah redesigned privacy and data risk management programs for Fortune 50 and 100 companies globally at Deloitte. She's also seen firsthand occasions where profits may override privacy decisions and how the long tail of data collection ends up at unknown third parties. So, like Renee, she's a trained lawyer, and two things I just want to highlight in her background as well is that she served in the Peace Corps after completing her undergrad degree at Georgetown, and she interned at the Citizens Complaint Bureau during law school. So she remains vigilant and passionate about promoting digital trust while driving market innovation. And today she's advising clients across a wide range of industries as the regulatory requirements and business needs change. So I'm so excited. Thank you, my three panelists. You guys are the rock stars that I don't think we could have, asked for anyone better. So just excited to talk to you. But before we get into that, I just want our audience to consider that there are multiple layers to privacy. So today in this webinar, we're going to discuss kind of the three layers. There's the legal and political layer. Then there's the general security layer, when you think about physical and cybersecurity. And then that next layer is the health data security. So, you, the audience, are likely here because you've seen something in the news headlines that piqued your interest. Today, we want to address the good, the bad, and the ugly of private health-related data. And we'll look at its collection and use for both the benefit and detriment of us as individuals and humankind. And then we'll examine what protections exist and really what needs to be enhanced. So let's get started with our very first poll. So you guys should see this up here on the screen. So the question is, when you think of your health-related information, what do you include in your thinking? And there are, I believe, 6 things here. And I want you to select all that are applied to you. Is it just the physical health genetic stuff? Is it fitness and nutrition? Would you also add the next things like age, gender, race? Would you add income and economic means? Would you add where you live and work? And finally, would you also add in all the metadata that devices and information has about it, such as the time it was collected, what device it was collected on, the IP address of the device? So we'll give you maybe 30 more seconds to complete this and just be as honest as you possibly can. What do you think of when you think of health data? All right, 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to end this poll and I'm going to share these results for you. So if you can see across all 6 of them, 100% of you, when you think of health data, absolutely think of the very top thing: physical health, mental health, and genetics information. But interestingly, at the lowest score was you don't think of your income or economic means as kind of health related data, when in fact, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to tell you that health data is any data, and I quote, related to health conditions, reproductive outcomes, causes of death, and quality of life, end quote, for an individual or population. Health data includes clinical metrics, along with environmental, socioeconomic, and behavioral information pertinent to health and wellness. So in fact, every single thing of those 6 that I asked you to select is in fact health-related data. So if you didn't include every category in your list, you should reconsider what you think of as your own health data. So let's just get into into our topic. So recent news headlines suggest that vast amounts of our private physical health, mental health, genetics, and fitness data is being collected and sold without our knowledge or consent. So before I bring in the panelists, let's do just one more really quick poll. And that is about how much do you care that your private physical health, mental health, genetics, and fitness data is being collected and sold without, this is again, without your knowledge or consent? A lot, a little, or not at all? And there's no judgment. These are anonymous answers. Wait for another 20 seconds. So I'm going to end the poll and share these results. And I think that you guys probably are not surprised that most of you on this call care a lot about it. I will say, if you talk to the whole range of everyone in society, which, you know, I've probably talked to thousands of people, not everyone's going to say a lot. And they make assumptions there. So I'm going to stop sharing and let's just move on into the topic and get our panelists engaged. So, Renee, should we be as panicked as the headlines are suggesting?
So I'm going to give an answer that illustrates why people don't like lawyers. Yes and no. I think yes, because I think there's a lot of very sensitive consumer data that exists out there, but it's not just in the places we think. And when you talk to law enforcement people, they will tell you that a lot of your data already exists on the dark web. And this is where a lot of bad actors are able to access all kinds of personal information, names, social security number, and a whole bunch of other things. I think that's where we really ought to be focusing our attention on. I think the rest of it, some of it is headline grabbing. It gets a lot of attention, but I'm not sure how much damage is actually being done. So there's my very lawyerly yes and no answer.
And Sarah, do you have anything you'd like to add to what Renee just said about should we be as panicked as headlines suggest?
Oh, I think Renee gave a great attorney answer, yes and no. The only thing I'd add real quick is that, you know, I think especially, and I know we may have time to touch on a little bit of AI today if possible, but I think one of the things to consider as everyone thinks through these topics is the sort of unintended consequences of the data processing that's already happening. So Renee's right, a lot of our data is already out there, but the sort of data analytics, the crunching of our data together in different forms, think of it almost like baking. I'm baking different kinds of, I don't know, pastries or something. And I may get a different outcome even if I'm using similar ingredients. I think that's the space that is maybe more worrisome to me. So when there's an adverse outcome due to these different kinds of baking situations, either in financial services or certainly in healthcare or something like insurance, all sorts of interconnected webs. So I agree with Renee, yes and no.
But can I just say that I totally agree with what Sarah just said, but some of it, the cat's already out of the horse is already out of the barn, right? This information is out there, it exists. A lot of actors, legitimate actors, are using this information, for example, insurance, to underwrite their risks. Is there any scaling back from that? And that's the kind of thing we need to really think about at this point.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of, so completely agree with a yes and no from a consumer standpoint. When you think about what it means to have your data out there, especially in healthcare, you got to think about two things. It's a double-edged sword, right? You share your genetic information. It can be used for good in terms of predicting different types of disease. And at the same time, you can be potentially at risk for many things. One of it is, and it's great that we have legal infrastructure in place, legal frameworks in place like GINA, and we'll talk about it more later on. But you can be discriminated based off of what you are at risk for in terms of disease for like health insurance or employment. And I know we'll take a deep dive, but completely agree with what both of you are saying as well.
And thank you so much for like setting the stage for kind of these news headlines we're all seeing. Sarah, can you walk us through a quick example of how healthcare data gets trafficked from, say, a fitness or mental health app, maybe such as Fitbit, and ends up with a third party, wait on the line, or with law enforcement, or being sold?
Sure. Well, I think the quickest way I usually talk about this is actually I don't know if anyone's into craft cocktails. Think of, watching your favorite craft cocktail be constructed in front of your very eyes and then poured out into your glass. Really what happens is, data brokers get your data in a whole host of different ways, usually from essentially middlemen, let's say. And they put them often into data aggregators. And that, I really think of those as really like the cocktail shaker of choice for all this data transfer. And they shake up different pieces of data, right? It could be your geolocation. It could be some of your shopping history. It could be your email address, your age, your height, your weight. It could be all sorts of different things. Your heartbeat, if you have a Fitbit. Then they shake it all up in these data aggregators and these cocktail shakers, and they pour them out into different types of glasses, which are really companies who are paying for, this is the legitimate side. Renee was correct. There's certainly a whole dark web element to this that I'm not going to go into right now. It's a whole other conversation. But the legitimate part of this is done sort of a little bit more in the light of day. In any case, different companies pay different amounts for different kinds of cocktails and of our data. And so that's really how it kind of all gets pulled together and then poured out and redistributed. So if you go to a random coffee shop and you buy coffee from a no-name coffee shop in the middle of nowhere, but then you get an email or receipt, how did they get your email address? It's based on this cocktail shaker scenario. Renee, do you want to throw in anything specific from the healthcare front?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think it works very much the same with a lot of the health apps you see that are out there. And by the way, there are hundreds of thousands of these apps out there. A lot of them are not really facilitating clinical care, but nevertheless collect a lot of sensitive information. So I love that analogy you use, Sarah. It really sort of crystallizes the issue and how this works.
Thank you so much, both of you, for that example, because I want to look at the healthcare laws. I would say some, if not a lot of people, assume that all of their health-related information is covered by HIPAA or some other privacy law, especially here in the US, when in fact, we know that HIPAA is a narrow law and it doesn't protect that much. But I want to, ask you, Renee, to kick off. because there's confusion around HIPAA specifically, with many people think it covers so much more than it does. What does a typical person need to understand? What does HIPAA actually protect? And HIPAA, I can't even recall what the actual acronym stands for. You might want to state that. And how does it actually protect us, and where does it not apply?
Yeah, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act is what HIPAA stands for. And there are a number of regulations under the HIPAA statute, including the ones we always talk about: the privacy regulation, the security regulation, and the breach notification regulation. Here's the one message I always try to get across to people. HIPAA does not cover as much as you think. It's a limited law, limited regulation. What do I mean by that? Usually when people talk about HIPAA, they're talking about the information that is protected, but that's not the threshold question. The threshold question is the entity that is using, disclosing, sharing the information actually covered under HIPAA at all? That's the first question you have to ask. And so when you look at HIPAA, it only applies to covered entities, which are healthcare providers, health plans, your insurers, and healthcare clearinghouses, and the folks that do functions on behalf of those covered entities or business associates. If you're not a covered entity or business associate, even if you store the most sensitive health data, HIPAA does not apply to you. And I hope everybody comes away from this understanding that. And so it's a very limited law and set of regulations. And I think a lot of people think HIPAA just covers all health data, and it doesn't. So for example, an app you download, that app provider is not a health plan. It's not a healthcare provider transmitting certain kinds of data. It's not a healthcare clearinghouse. It's not doing any business on behalf of those kinds of entities. Therefore, HIPAA does not apply to that app developer. And so other laws may apply, but HIPAA does not apply. And so I think we need to understand the limits of HIPAA. Now, that's not to say there are not other laws that may apply, but I think this particular question on HIPAA, I think, needs to be fully understood.
And let me just ask you a quick question on the HIPAA protection. Does it change? So we had an event coming up on a year ago when Roe v. Wade was overturned via the Dobbs decision. Does anything change as a result of anything that is covered by HIPAA as a result of the Dobbs decision?
Well, the HIPAA laws and regulations don't change, but I think there are some exceptions under HIPAA, which I think a lot of people are nervous about that apply, and we don't need to get into those right now. And there are also a lot of other actors that could impact the availability of information regarding whether a woman goes to see a fertility doctor, goes to see an abortion clinic, has some kind of period tracker. A lot of those entities that are trafficking that information are not covered under HIPAA at all. So Dobbs doesn't change that portion of it. And I think that's why you're starting to see some activity on Capitol Hill to pass comprehensive federal privacy legislation that would address all these issues, particularly the non-HIPAA covered data that's out there. And last I checked, I think we're the only industrialized country that does not have comprehensive federal legislation. That may be about to change.
And Sarah, anything really quick to add? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Felix about GINA.
Yeah, no, I would just add, I think at some point we're going to talk a little bit about enforcement, but I would just say, the Office of Civil Rights is who enforces HIPAA in the Department of Justice. And they're not famous for really strong and aggressive enforcement. Thanks for laughing, Renee. The Federal Trade Commission arguably is making a strong, some might say power grab to be the sort of enforcer of choice around many things cyber related, of which privacy and data risk are only one, dimension. So I think we're going to head that direction a little bit, but that's all I would add, is that without enforcement, all sorts of decisions get made within public companies or public or corporate domains. Let me put it that way.
Great. So Felix, you mentioned the word GINA, and I would guess Never heard of what Gina is, so.
Yeah, so Gina, so let me just take a step back. So what Renee was talking about is absolutely, it's limited. HIPAA is limited. Most people feel that HIPAA covers everything. So based on that limitation, Gina comes in. So Gina is a Genetic Information Non-Discriminatory Act. So what it essentially does, it protects individuals based on their personal information, more specific to genetic information, from being discriminated against in terms of employment or getting health insurance. So what does that mean in terms of an individual now taking a test like 23andMe, right? So think of it in terms of the power of information. So never in the history of humankind are we able to predict whether you're at risk for a whole bunch of different types of disease. So in this case, let's focus on cancer. So there's two specific gene expressions that 23andMe actually considers. It's BRCA1 or BRCA1 and BRCA2. Now, based on those two gene expressions, now you can actually predict whether you're at risk for breast or ovarian cancer. So that's a tremendous amount of information that can actually help you prevent cancer to begin with. On the flip side, that could also pose a risk in terms of applying for health insurance. So, like I said earlier, it's a double-edged sword, and then that's where Gina comes in.
And then, thank you so much for that. And Renee and Sarah, are there any other health, mental health, other kind of privacy data laws that are protecting our private health information that really should be on our radar?
Oh, there are all kinds, and that's part of the problem, right? It's sort of the smorgasbord of laws. So I think last I checked, 6 states have passed comprehensive privacy laws. I know everybody talks about California, but I know Virginia, Colorado, Utah, Washington just passed one in reaction to Dobbs. So a lot of states are getting involved and are passing their own state-specific laws. They're all different. They all have different provisions, leading to a lot of other kinds of confusion. Some states also protect certain kinds of data and information related to certain kinds of conditions. Mental health is always one that seems to be afforded greater protection, HIV status, things like that. So there's a lot out there. On the federal side, Sarah talked about FTC, and she's exactly right. They're really flexing their muscles, both under Section 5 and breach notification rule as well. And then you've got a smorgasbord of other federal laws like Part 2 that offers privacy protections for substance abuse records for any facilities, drug abuse facilities or drug treatment facilities that are funded in part by federal dollars. So therein lies part of the problem, that if you are, for example, a national organization and you really want to get all your privacy compliance ducks in a row, there is so much out there. Some of it is inconsistent. It's confusing. It's a confusing landscape that compliance becomes a problem.
And that's compliance for the companies. And here we are as citizens sitting out there feeling a little bit overwhelmed, it seems. So I'm gonna shift this a little bit to just look at our own health data in total. And this data is certainly being used to profile and target us as much as it can be used for good. But we also know it can be easily weaponized against us. So, Renee, Sarah, Felix, I'm going to let whoever goes first raise your hand. Who's targeting us? Why? And how concerned should we be? So I guess I'll start with you, Renee.
Target. I have a little issue with the word target because it has negative connotations, but it could be positive, and we can get into that. But I think we're talking about everybody from folks who are advertising services to folks who just want certain kinds of data for all kinds of reasons, right? So I think the universe is wide in terms of who's targeting us. But then I want to get back to something I mentioned before. We're worried about sort of the legitimate actors, and legitimate in quotes, in this space. But I think we've got more to worry about with illegitimate actors doing things in the dark on the dark web that we don't know about, which have absolutely monumental effects on us. And if you talk to law enforcement people, they say that's where we face the real danger. And one of the probably underreported stories out there is all the ransomware attacks on our healthcare facilities in the United States. A lot of the healthcare facilities don't want to report this for obvious reasons, but there have been some really, really bad attacks. And to me, those are the kinds of things we ought to be more worried about.
And Sarah, do you have anything you want to add about kind of us being profiled, targeted? I will throw out there that I know that, looking at things there everything from political campaigns to criminals to, pharmaceutical companies. I mean, it's a massive range of people out there looking for our data.
Yeah, no, I not to parrot everybody, but I agree with both gentlemen. I mean, the reality is that certainly some of this is sort of already out of the bag, so to speak. I think it's probably a fair way to say it. And there is a real concern of illegitimate actors. I think Renee is bringing up a really salient point. But at the same time, I'm a bit of a realist. And just to back up a second, laws will always lag behind cyber and technology. That's not going to surprise anybody, I don't think. And without meaningful enforcement, companies can be left without, in scenarios where they're really, even when they're trying to do the very best job they possibly can, are sometimes left without, in scenarios where it's harder for them to make decisions about what they're going to do in the absence of, meaningful enforcement or really understandable regulation, maybe is a way to put it. And so it's not so much who's targeting us, although of course, yes, that's happening. But it's really, I think it's even more so the fact that even if no one was had super nefarious reasons for looking for data and trying to process data, I just think that unfortunately that's going to happen regardless. And it really, I am in the camp clearly where I feel that meaningful enforcement is really the best way to move forward, because at the individual level, your best bet is to keep rejecting all every time you go to a new website that says, hey, do we have your permission to track and watch your movement across the web in various ways. And the reality is that is an imperfect option for individuals. So Felix or Renee, I'm so sorry, by the way, I can't see people. I apologize. Zoom is apparently not allowed in France. So I'm sorry, I can't see everybody's beautiful faces.
Good point. We're smiling, Sarah, if you're wondering.
Oh, good.
So a positive vibe.
Hopefully.
No, we're smiling. So on the flip side, so targeting, right, Renee, to your point, targeting can be used for good, right? So from a digital health company standpoint, we're targeting people who are at risk for cancer for good reasons, right? And they willingly disclose their risk for breast cancer based on the example that I shared earlier. So what does that do, right? The power of information that connects them with the right individuals, the right resources, the best resources to prevent cancer to begin with. So think about that from that standpoint, right? But to Sarah's point, the legal framework always lags behind technology, right? AI is moving at a really fast pace. We can now predict different types of disease, but in terms of a company founder, it's really at the end of the day based on your ethical decision making, right? And like for example, Helen Health, our goal really, and we discussed a roadmap later on. We really want to be able to be completely transparent in terms of our company's policies, in terms of how we handle and safeguard an individual's information. So it hasn't been done yet, especially most startups. That's the last thing they really want to think about. They just want to move fast and break things. To Meta, right? Alluding to Meta, that's the philosophy that most successful startups have. And safeguarding your consumers' information is the last thing that should be on your mind. But in this case, it shouldn't be, because we're talking about people's lives, healthcare. Okay, so we should be transparent and I'm talking about founders of digital health companies. Do you have anything to add, Renee or Sarah?
Nah, well said.
But I am going to
No,
jump
that
in.
was really well said. I would just throw in also, oh, forgive me, I apologize. I'll just throw in real quick. You know, another example that maybe wouldn't naturally come to mind is, you know, blood donation scenarios, right? At one point, the public one I can talk about, you know, at Meta was really trying to encourage people in certain countries and across certain demographics to donate more blood. But one of the ways that sort of came across, you know, there was a fair amount of targeting in that instance, yes, for health reasons, right? They wanted to encourage better health outcomes for folks from certain types of backgrounds. And, you know, presumably we'd all like people to donate more blood and thus help, you know, support the health of our fellow man. But, you know, asking questions in the Sudan about whether or not you use intravenous drugs or who you might sleep with in your spare time, you know, can really convey things that in the Sudan are much more, you know, dangerous to have out there than just whether or not you're going to go donate blood. So forgive me, it sounded like someone else was going to jump in.
Yeah, so I'm gonna move us on but I just want to say really, really quickly, when law enforcement, because you guys talk about law enforcement and enforcement of things on one side, if law enforcement subpoenas or prosecutors subpoena for health information, can anything be handed over? Is one question I think we would love to have answered, you know, for our audience.
Yeah, under HIPAA, HIPAA has an exception that allows covered entities to disclose protected health information to law enforcement officials pursuant to a court order or court warrant, right? And then, you know, you've got to comply with what the warrant asks if it's signed by a judge, right? It's so, you see that even outside the health data section where warrants are presented to big tech companies for certain kinds of data and certain kinds of records. And for the most part, most of those entities comply with law enforcement. And then the other piece you see, for those of you who watch 2020 or Dateline or some of these real crime shows, you see the use of these genealogy sites, right, to backstop and backtrack identification of criminals whose DNA may not be on any kind of law enforcement system. So you see quite a lot of that. But law enforcement has a lot of power here. Now, the one caveat I would add is I think there's recognition that law enforcement ought to have these powers to get certain kinds of data. But I think post-Dobbs, I think there is a recognition that a lot of this could be weaponized in a way that's probably not a good thing. And so I think you're seeing calls from groups like the ACLU and other privacy advocates really looking for greater protections for certain kinds of data. And I think that's going to play out over the next year or so.
Great, thank you. And by the way, for our audience, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A. When we get to that section, we'll be able to look at your questions at that point in time. So let's quickly go through just the health data collection. Because data collection is off the charts. It's top of mind when we tend, you know, and for health, you know, data, we tend to think of, okay, we're giving our health data to doctors, hospitals, labs, and their clinical staff. But you know, we covered it a little bit earlier, so I want to go through speed through this a little bit. But, you know, Sarah, who has our data and how many places does it end up? Is there any conceivable way that we as individuals could possibly figure this out?
Oh, ouch. I don't have a good, easy answer to the latter part of your question. Again, I think as individual consumers, you know, taking an extra second when you go to new websites to sort of reject extra cookies is unfortunately probably the imperfect option right now. But the candid answer about who has our data is both, I mean, tons of both legitimate and illegitimate sources do have our data. And just as a frame of reference though, and this is where, you know, when we get to AI, maybe that'll be more important part of the conversation, but just as a point of reference, I've never, ever had a single client anywhere in the world that actually had a very strong handle on all the data that a strong handle on every scintilla of data that they had, where they got it, who they got it from, who they were giving access to it to, which is different than actually handing it over to another, a third party. Whether or not they were, able to trace certain lines on what we call data lineage. So think of a daisy chain of a game of telephone. Well, I tell you and you tell someone else and whatnot. Well, eventually someone might miss the message. So the long and short of it, I think here is that it would be hard to put limits on who, quote unquote, who actually has all the data. I think data aggregators are kind of the big ones that are, think of those almost like point guards. They're the ones that kind of dish out the data to others. But I unfortunately don't have a phenomenal answer for people. There are multiple, as Renee said, with all the new state laws in the United States, and I presume most of the people on the call are in the US, increasingly states are putting private rights of action into their privacy laws. And, it's yet to be seen how that's going to move forward, but that is probably one way that people could more effectively assert their rights. But, Felix and Renee may have a different opinion on this.
Well, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, Renee, because I want to really just talk about AI for a second.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is you've got to look at how much data is generated every day. To sort of build on Sarah's point about organizations not having a good handle on data and data hygiene. Look, there are 3 quintillion bits of data that are produced every day. There's just, and it's going to increase exponentially. It has increased exponentially over the last few years. And with demands from AI, I think this is just going to explode even more. And so the question is, how are you supposed to manage this? And I think in some ways this is almost unmanageable, at least with the resources and the technology we have today.
So let's just talk about, how does AI play into this? I mean, Felix, you are a data analyst, trained data analyst, and I know you're looking at AI even for your company. So, what are your thoughts on how AI is going to either exacerbate this or help?
Well, let's take a step back first. AI is neither good or bad. AI is a tool, right? So a lot of people, you hear a lot of news that it can potentially wreak havoc in many ways, right? And to be focused on healthcare, a lot of people are concerned whether it's going to be used or misused. So it's a tool. That's the main takeaway here. One biggest thing that will happen the next 10, 20, 30 years is that AI will be able to predict different types of disease. That's a given. When you look at being able to understand whether you're at risk or not, that's not something that is common. Physicians are great, but they're trained to diagnose disease when it's too late. So take, for example, cancer. You find out when you're at stage 3 or stage 4. You won't find out at this point whether you're at stage 0. And the next step is, what do you do so you don't even get cancer? So that's where AI factors in terms of predictability of getting cancer to begin with. But broader than, and the broader scale really is AI as a tool to be able to predict different types of disease. Okay, so is it a good thing? I think so. That's my personal opinion. Is it a bad thing? When you think about the implications across the board, there's many. Think about physicians who are trained pathologists, right? You have AI now being more accurate in terms of detecting cancer than a trained pathologist. So there's a lot of implications there in terms of how not just it affects healthcare in terms of diagnosis. It also affects the workforce, right? So it's a very it's a multi-pronged effect, if you will. But I think the most important thing is to understand that it is a tool and how it is utilized, and how not just hospitals use it, but companies who are going through the development of using AI. I'm talking about startups, I'm talking about big companies, big healthcare companies working closely with startups is to understand how that would actually help their workflow. Okay.
All right, thank you. And I don't feel it. Sorry, Renee, you look like you were trying to say something. So do you
No,
wanna- Okay.
nothing.
All right, and Sarah, any final thoughts on how AI is playing into this, into kind of the whole gamut of data collection and everything?
Yeah, I think you know, this is a really good lens through which I try to look at this through the lens of both kind of, is this collection and processing of our personal data, is it good or is it bad? You know, if we can just, for a quick second, because I'm not a data scientist, if we can just agree for 2 seconds that a decent artificial intelligence definition is automated decision making. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but just for a moment. You know, there are elements, you know, automated decision making can actually help you find and drive more helpful outcomes, as to, you know, kind of what Felix was already talking about. So as an example, right, you can, let's pretend for a second that there are folks with genetic makeups that aren't as prevalent. You know, there's just a little tweak here or there, and only, I don't know, a handful of million people actually have that kind of genetic reality. And so it's not enough people with that genetic, let's pretend, abnormality that would require treatment to get as much visibility across researchers who are trying to really, you know, make sure they get funded and can study, you know, how to help and treat those people. You know, being able to crunch the numbers in ways that help direct funds, as an example, for research, I think is really powerful. At the same time, there's, you know, all sorts of negative potential impacts, especially in the sense of, you know, should someone be approved for whether or not their health premium should be higher or lower, or they should be given the green light for a type of surgery based on, you know, a risk profile that might include all sorts of Internet of Things, IoT device information. For example, I've moved from DC to California, and now I let my gas tank get down all the way to like a quart. It's so expensive out there. I let my gas tank get down to maybe a quarter full when I fill it up. Well, that goes through, you know, these cocktail shakers, as I say, and frankly will make me appear to be a higher level risk for all sorts of things, because I wait longer now to get my gas tank filled. So again, unfortunately, it's a bit of a complicated thing, but
yeah, Sarah, I just want to add, thanks for sharing that. I think the key there is to aggregate the right type of data to begin with, right? It is not, and that's the biggest problem right now. It is not a well-represented data set. It is not a well-represented data set, and that's something we're also struggling with, and we understand it's a challenge, and we're trying to get data, aggregate the right data across the board. And I'm not just talking about socioeconomic, I'm talking about the whole gamut of the right type of data set. So decision-making becomes accurate at the end of the day.
You know, any final wrap up word, because I want to move on to just one quick thing. Okay.
Yes.
So, all right. So we've kind of been talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly, how AI plays into this. I'm just going to put up a quick poll. It has 3 questions. I think you guys can see it now. So this is all in the single poll. So let's just, you know, based on what you've heard so far, what your own opinions are, you know, whether you've changed them or what you brought in, but are you happy? Do you still, you know, feel happy to share your health data for the good of society, even if it's without your consent? That's the first question. Are you concerned that your data is being used to your detriment or fearful that it could be? And then finally, which do you feel? Does the good outweigh the bad when it comes to your data being shared with third parties without your consent? So just leave this up here for probably another minute, because to give you guys time to enter your answers. And again, these are anonymous responses. Okay, I'm going to end the poll in 10 seconds. Okay, I'm ending the poll, and I think it's just interesting for everyone to see that it's pretty much dead on mixed, that people are yes or no, and we do not have clear consensus of people being happy to share their data. Similarly, for the good of society, but overwhelmingly, people are feeling that it's being used to their own detriment. Overarchingly, it still seems most people right now feel the good does not outweigh the bad. They feel the bad is definitely outweighing the good. So clearly something needs to, be done and thought about. And I think we need to kind of get our politicians and our companies out there to kind of really kind of hold on to this and think about what can we do to make changes.
Just to weigh in here, those are interesting numbers there, right? But I think it goes to a larger issue of trust. And I think the reason you see those numbers is I think there's a lack of trust in healthcare institutions, their ability to control our data, the ability to manage our data. I remember we did a report and there was a poll out that data privacy reasons are one of the issues for lack of trust in the healthcare system. And in particular, what this survey showed was that patients were really concerned that healthcare organizations and entities were going to share certain kinds of data. And the three that I remember off the top of my head were chronic disease data, mental health data, and pharmacy data with their employer, number one, or with government entities. And so I think there's a huge built-in mistrust in the system. I think that's why you see the data you see there. And this reminds me of what happened during the pandemic. If you remember, during the pandemic, there was this notion of contract tracing and exposure notification programs using the technology and data from smartphones to sort of better manage and predict who had COVID and from a public health perspective, better manage exposure. And if you remember, that largely failed because of privacy concerns. People didn't want to share that data, even if it was for the public good, with not only tech companies, but with the government. And so that's just one example of where a lot of that data could have been used for good. And if you see how other societies and other countries were able to manage COVID, a lot of it was through this kind of concept, which is share your data for the good and allow public health authorities to better manage this pandemic. So that's just one example off the top of my head. But I understand these numbers because of the distrust of the system.
And if I could just briefly riff, forgive me, but because I'm so passionate about digital trust, Renee, it was like you just tossed me a softball. I couldn't agree with you more. But here's the thing: is that I think that I think that ethical data use is very possible with a little extra forethought and effort. I think that this is where you get into the conversation, I think, about, or at least for me, as overly a realist around not only enforcement, but not every company recognizes the market value of establishing and maintaining digital trust, which is, tricksy to establish at times, depending on your industry, and can easily be lost. So, when you hear someone like Felix as a leader in his field and his company, clearly so keeping this at the forefront of what he and his organization are doing, I hope that all gives you real heartening, warm fuzzies, because out of the many clients I've supported, there can sometimes be a real tension between, for lack of a better quick term, ethical data use and profits or speed, perhaps, in certain situations. So anyway, Renee, a big high five. I agree with you.
And Felix, what I was going to say is, your company sees that one of your competitive advantages
Correct.
is using, kind of consumer data in a very secure manner and being very transparent. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I think that usually when you think about, and to your point, Renee, completely agree. There's that huge mistrust, right? And when, especially at the startup stage, that's the last thing that most founders think about. How do you build that trust with your users, right? So think about that for a second, right? How do you actually explain it that it's top of mind in terms of how you handle your data, right? So that's something that Helen Health is actually going through right now. How do we turn it into a competitive advantage that makes us very different from the incumbents, right? And I think it's not just me. I think it should be a consortium of founders of digital health companies that are growing, that are getting into the later stage, that we should actually explain, not just explain, but understand, discuss, have that discussion within the company, how we actually first and foremost safeguard the consumer's healthcare information. Second, how we actually explain it to have complete disclosure and transparency to the consumer and say, this is how we handle your information and you can trust us, and have that dialogue back and forth, like a town hall meeting or whatnot, to address their concerns, right? I think it starts at the grassroots level, right? Especially with startups, with fairly young companies, you can still make that change. For bigger companies, that's a tougher pivot, so to speak, and it's tougher to actually build that trust once you're a bigger company. But I think it should be a consortium of smaller companies working together, being able to change the perception. What are your thoughts, Renee, Sarah?
I mean, I'm reminded of, sort of the old axiom, we say one thing, we do something else. And I like that idea, but I guess the question from consumer perspective is, first of all, how do they know you're actually adhering to your policies, your principles?
Mm-hmm.
And if they find out you're not, what is their recourse outside of law? And I think I think a lot of consumers just feel helpless because they don't have any legitimate recourse to address some of these issues, concerns, and sort of breaches in trust. So that's the question I would throw back.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So what if, since we're on that topic, right? What if companies work closely with policymakers, folks at Capitol Hill? So there's that checks and balances in place, right? So we're not just saying things, but we can be held accountable at the end of the day, right? Just food for thought, right?
Yeah. And you that word is so important. Accountability. It's such an important part of trust. So I agree with you there. And the other thing too is, I think you bring up a very good issue, is if we are waiting for government to help solve this, and I think Sarah brought up this point earlier in the discussion, is they're behind for all kinds of reasons, and they always will be. So we need to get creative about how to better protect consumers with the help of government, but not relying solely on government, because it's just not going to happen.
Amen. Agree. Completely agree with that.
And I'm going to just...
I would just say, well, one thing might be interesting to ask our friends in the audience, to what degree do you feel I'm sorry that I'm riffing. I don't know that we can do this live, but it would be interesting for you all to consider to what degree you all, no doubt, all do all sorts of things professionally. To what degree do you think that your companies, would put their money where their mouth is on these types of issues? The way I addressed it at Meta was to build this, code level audit, right, program, which is honestly quite complicated. And a lot of companies don't, I think, have the resources. Startups could do this kind of thing with less sort of barrier to entry, but for bigger companies, some of them decide that taking the fines on the chin or other sort of challenges are preferable to the amount of time, effort, and resource allocation for really addressing this space. I think code audits is one of the few ways that government could essentially put frameworks in place that allow them the time to go back later, right? And evaluate, hey, were you complying or were you not? But to even set up code level audits are again, it's a whole other conversation. It's pretty complicated, but agree with unsurprisingly, perhaps.
Okay,
Sorry,
and
Alexa, I didn't mean
Sarah,
to cut you off.
that's okay, Sarah. While I have you on, I'm going to ask you in, just very, very quickly. We're going to just be very quick because we want to get to the questions that are kind of coming into the Q&A. But the whole thing is that right now consumers are sitting there inundated with, okay, do you want to accept the cookies? And then at the same time, every time we're forced to, we want to use a new app or go to things, we're asked to read the terms of service and privacy policy. And, before we can get in, we are saying, okay, you must agree to this. So, what is your thinking, given that you were at a big tech company, how understandable and accessible these terms of service and privacy policies are, knowing that the average person is not a lawyer and they don't have a lot of time to dedicate to learning all of the terminology and reading all of this stuff? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I think I'm saying the obvious, that people do not tend to read terms of service and privacy policy. I was at a dinner last night with 14 people and every single person just flat out said, no, I don't do it. I just click, 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 because it's too much. They're overwhelmed.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is legally, there's no duty to read any contract, technically speaking. And so many people, don't read all sorts of contracts up to and including terms of service for all sorts of things. So there's technically no duty to read. And there's an imbalance of power, right? So it's not like you can say, oh, I read it, and then I'm going to call, I don't know, Zoom, pick an application. I'm going to call Zoom and I want them to renegotiate this clause that I didn't like and I'm not going to agree to, or something like that, right? That doesn't, there's a certain rigidity to this process that consumers don't have a lot of say over. So I think at the moment, something I used to talk about with executives is public shaming. I think consumers can do a better job of voicing their concerns across the media, across with their elected officials. They can get involved in these issues. I certainly think those are options. And then I'd also say, there really are increased private rights of action across these different state level laws. I don't know how closely Renee is watching some of this, so he might have better on hand facts. These laws are so new that I, with the exception of California, I don't know that there's great data out yet. Possibly another avenue is to try and initiate, a complaint personally. Or potentially join a class action that you think is credible. The last quick thing is just that again, when enforcement is in a place where it only convinces some people to play by certain rules, you're going to get a real mismatch in real life as to how companies treat the data, right? There's sort of the paperwork and contracts in terms of service, and then there's what companies actually do from a sort of a controls and procedure perspective.
I think there, and I agree with a lot of that, but I do think there's a piece missing here, which is the consumer responsibility angle of this, right? And that one of the reasons people don't read the terms of service, and Sarah's absolutely right, you can't dicker over the terms, you either accept them or you don't. But the reason a lot of people don't read it is because they want whatever service, whatever tool that app is offering for free. And so they're willing to, they make a bargain, whether they admit it or not, they make a bargain. I am going to get this, this GPS app and I'm going to download it on my phone. I'm going to just click the yes, I've agreed to the terms of service, because I know at the end of it, I'm going to get a very valuable tool to me for free. And I understand in some way that the reason they're offering it to me for free is because they get a whole bunch of data on me, right? And I think that's the part of it we need to discuss, that there's a consumer responsibility angle here as well, that if you don't agree with the terms of service, don't download the app, don't use the app, right? And so I think that's part of it too. And the other piece of it is, I sometimes wonder, and I've seen some surveys on this, consumers say they care about privacy and say all the right things about privacy. I'm talking about the average consumer, not this audience, which is highly informed, but they do and say other things. I am not sure that this is as high on a level of concern to the average consumer as some of us think it is. Otherwise, they would act differently. And maybe that's simplifying the situation, but I think that's a piece that we really need to discuss.
And I think that's a great segue into, kind of just talking about some of the actions we as consumers can take. So, Molly, if you can put up our final slide, there are a number of things that we can do to protect our health-related information from ending up in the hands of what we're calling data snatchers, just anyone who's collecting our data. And I worked with the panelists and SecureTheVillage to arrive at our top 5 do's and don'ts. So, for one thing, we all want to remind everyone, please continue to trust your medical provider. We don't want you to stop going to the doctor, which is something when the Dobbs decision came out overturning Roe v. Wade, a lot of women in certain states were talking about no longer trusting their medical provider. And that was just very alarming because we don't want anyone to put their health at risk. At the same time, it's important to know your rights as a consumer. And I know it seems to be very muddled out there. There are over 600 privacy laws, a big mess of kind of even things that are covering health data. But still, do the best you can to continue to educate yourself and know your rights. Read the terms and privacy policies before accepting. Look, everyone's going to always tell you that. I think as we get on more and more, if you really are passionate about it, maybe you don't want to accept or use an app or use things, but you'll never know if you want to or don't unless you actually dig in and read a little bit of these things to understand what you're giving away. There are things you can do to protect your personal information, especially online. Limit the information sharing, change your privacy settings. Restrict the cookies when you're browsing, confirm the identity of anyone you're sharing with, in addition to just limiting, the sharing, and hide your internet activity. There's plenty of things out there that and steps you can take to do that. And I think one thing that is also interesting is hopefully after, listening to this webinar that you realize that you can be an advocate for yourself and, get involved in things to advocate. One of the biggest things you can advocate for is to opt in rather than what we're currently seeing in the US is having to opt out, because that's the biggest pain and none of us are doing it. Whereas in Europe, they have an opt-in model where you have to say, yes, I want to participate in that. Yes. So on the flip side, don't assume anyone else is out there that's secure or that they have your best interest at heart. I think that's part of one of the downsides. As Renee talked in the beginning, a lot of things are not subject to certain regulations or under certain laws. So don't make assumptions out there. Don't trust wearable devices and apps to maintain your privacy. They're not subject to HIPAA. There's a whole bunch of things that they can just go off and do. So if you're concerned about privacy, maybe think about don't trust them as much. Don't share your information with anyone you don't trust. Don't rely on these default settings on the devices and software. That's one of the biggest things. Change those privacy settings. The default settings are going to be to the company or developer's advantage, not to your advantage. And, maybe don't accept before reading. So, in a nutshell, that's our summary of do's and don'ts. I want to ask our panelists, as a wrap up, what's one thought or tap action that you want our audience to do when they leave this webinar? And I skipped ahead because I'm going to ask you really quickly before we go into Q&A, and then I'll ask you again at the end.
Sarah, you can start us off.
Sarah, do you have
Sorry,
one?
my connection just got a little tricky. Can someone repeat the question? It's hard to hear.
What's one thought or action you want the audience to do? So you can have a whole list of do's and don'ts, but what's the one thing that you would say, do this when you leave here?
Gosh, that's a tough one. Actually, I'd encourage everyone to think back up to that question of how much of processing of your health data are you comfortable with? Because you all have voices and opinions, and they matter. Until you really think a little bit more clearly about, am I okay with my health data helping save people that might get heart attacks or something like that, or ambulances should get sent out in ABC situation, it's hard to really activate your voice. So I'd urge you to think about what are your lines, what are your goes, no goes, so that you can really get involved if you'd like to be.
Great. Renee and Felix? Renee.
For me, it's back to the HIPAA point, which is please walk away from here with the understanding that HIPAA is incredibly limited, and that even though you're dealing with health data, HIPAA does not always apply. In fact, a lot of times it doesn't apply when it comes to a lot of online and other digital services. So just assume HIPAA does not apply unless you're dealing with a healthcare provider or a health plan.
And Felix.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this day and age, where genetic information is going to be prevalent, it's going to grow through time. There's no stopping it, but be aware of where your data ends up being. So be an advocate of your own data, safeguard your own data, and ask questions. Ask a lot of questions where it actually ends up.
Okay, thank you. Now, and again, please put your questions in here. So I'm just going to read out some of these questions to you guys. Sarah, you can't even see this. So here's one. Companies have consumer trust to lose to dissuade them from mishandling data. What incentives do agencies like law enforcement have to embrace constraint?
I'm not sure I fully understand the questions, but agencies are bound by the laws that govern them. I mean, it's really that simple. And if an agency can do something under law in order to complete their task and do their job, they're going to use whatever tools are available to them until the law says it's not, right? So, for example, I talked about the use of genealogy information and these genealogical services and how law enforcement has been using those to identify folks from DNA that has been collected that is not on any database. They're going to continue to do that until the law says you can't, right? And so they are trying to do a job. They have certain obligations. And so that's the only piece of it. And and the premise of the question about on the corporate side, that, a lot of consumer sentiment, anger, public relations nightmares could serve as constraints. A lot of people forget them. I mean, some of the largest brands have been hit by enormous breaches, and it maybe dented their brands for a little bit, but they just go back to where they were before. So I'm not even sure that constrains a lot of your private organizations.
So I'm going to direct this next question to you, Sarah. How frequently do corporations make demands for better privacy policies of their third-party ad services, marketing services, and vendors? So do you want me to repeat that?
Yes.
How frequently do corporations make demands for better privacy policies of their third parties, basically?
Well, I'll take a swipe. Happy to defer to others for what they might want to add. I think it depends on the company is the most honest answer I can give. Usually the biggest fish, candidly in my experience, tend to dictate terms. Sometimes that involves stronger privacy requirements, and sometimes it doesn't. One thing I've seen increasingly is essentially a requirement to be able to show you the books, right? So if I'm a big company Acme and I contract with little company, I don't know, whoever, I dictate the terms, and often I am increasingly requiring little company to at least contractually allow me to come and review their data privacy and data sort of practices. That's what I've seen.
Don't know, Felix or Renee, if you have anything you want to add.
Nothing to add.
Okay, so let's go on to the next question. How is my data shared between the DMV and health institutions? And this is specific to, that donor sticker on your driver's license. And is, information in your health files now shared with the DMV?
I'm not sure, but I'm not qualified to answer that question. I can find out though and get back to the asker.
That's fantastic. I don't know if anyone knew the answer on this call, but I think it's a good question though.
It is.
So here's a question that kind of came up earlier, which is, should we defer to the federal or state government, the healthcare providers, and or big companies to decide everything about, kind of data, our health data and on our data, as far as the laws and what we should want? I know traditionally that's what's been happening. We've been deferring to these guys, but should we?
Felix, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, be an advocate for your own data. I mean, it's a different mindset, right? I mean, by default, you feel that the government should protect you. You feel that you should be able to trust the company, the medical provider, whatnot. But at the end of the day, especially with direct-to-consumer products, the information is shared with you directly from True. 23andMe now has your information, but you should be able to safeguard that information, not disclose it to anyone, one. And number two, understand exactly where 23andMe sends the data. So be an advocate, protect your data, engage the companies that collect your data. That's a start. And in the perfect world, you'd hope that the companies that collect the information would make the right decisions. They have the right policies, company policies in place. And we were talking about it earlier, Renee, they're held accountable, right? But we're not there yet. There's a lot of work to be done. And to Sarah's point earlier, the legal framework always lags and technology kind of advances a step, 2 steps ahead, but I think it should catch up soon. So to answer your question, that's a long and protect your data, be an advocate, and ask a lot of questions, and work with folks who have the same mindset, and challenge big companies, ask those right questions.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
go ahead.
I was just going to add, for privacy advocates, I think there's actually good news on the Capitol Hill front. I think there are enough members of Congress and senators who take this issue incredibly seriously. And for the first time in my professional life, I think we're as close as we have ever been to having a federal comprehensive privacy regime in this country. There was a bill last Congress that failed, but if you look at all the provisions and the language in that bill, it does offer tremendous amounts of protections for consumers. Obviously, it didn't become law, but and it may not even become law this Congress. But I think in the next 5 years, I think you're going to see that, and I think that'll offer a certain baseline level of protection. But back to Sarah's point, the law is only as good as enforced, right? And that particular law that failed last year had really detailed language about enforcement, who was going to enforce, and really took that very seriously. So I think from a federal perspective, I think there could be some good news in terms of privacy protections in the next half decade or so.
Thank you. And I'm going to just ask a question, which is one of someone in the audience, Kenneth Hubbs, has asked, if we ignore what the laws are doing, should insurance companies be able to use health data? And they're asking specifically on genome, but I would just say any health data to provide and price individual health insurance. So should they have access to that data to be able to price the individual health insurance?
I-
And this thing is, there's the should, and then thing if so, then how would we balance that with privacy and confidentiality?
So I guess the question is if you're at higher risk, and that goes back to Gina, right? Your insurance increase. I think we're
But if
stating
you
the obvious here.
yeah.
Yeah. That's
But let
that's
me-
an interesting question. Yeah.
It is, but let me throw
Renee.
something. Let me just throw a counterpoint in here. And if you're an insurance company, your business is managing risk and underwriting
Mhm.
risk in a proper way.
Mhm.
And shouldn't an insurance company have all the available information in order to evaluate that risk accurately and properly? It's just a question I throw out there, right? And I'm not saying that they should have that data, but that's where the insurance company is coming from. So you see it in property and casualty now, right? If you get car insurance, it used to be if you were a certain age, if you were a certain gender, they looked at your driving record, and that's how they evaluated the risk. But now they got sensors in the vehicle, so they're really evaluating you individually, and they can better manage that individual risk. Insurance companies say, yay, that's exactly what we want to do, instead of the crude tool we were using before, where we were just dumping people in certain categories and charging a premium that way.
Mhm.
And it works both ways, right? If you're a great driver, you've got great habits, you don't speed, you'll be priced one way. If you're a reckless driver, you'll be priced another way. And some of that information was never captured by speeding tickets and everything else. So just something to throw out there, that insurance companies are trying to manage their risk, and should they have all the available data? So it's a fine line, but it's something that we got to think about.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would just, to riff off that, I there are all sorts of elements to this, right? On the one hand, should people that are, overweight be paying more for airline tickets, right? Where we all pay, at least on some level, for the amount of gas that's used, and the heavier the plane is, we apparently use more gas, things like that. And I think there's some elements of that kind of thing in what you're referencing, Renee. Though I agree, and should companies, in particular ones that are focused on risk, and their risk analysis capability is what keeps them in business, right? So I agree. There's some real fine lines there, but I think my concern in this space is a little bit more about the crunching of data and the deference to the what the crunching of data means to that leads to some sort of outcome. So to your point about speeding, yeah, maybe speeding, again, I'm not a data scientist, but maybe speeding is a great indicator that you're at much higher risk of being in an accident. And yet I have no idea what's the data on folks that have lead feet within a certain parameter, or who knows what, that have never been in an accident or collision. So, agreed. It can go both ways, and I think that space gets real complicated. Yeah, and then the last quick thing, potentially obvious to folks on the call, is that this is already happening. I mean, whether we're interested in the should or shouldn't conversation, the reality is that it's already happening. Pharmaceutical benefit managers, as an example, who are think of those as the brain trust that enables us to get our prescriptions from a doctor and then have it filled at Costco or at Walgreens or CVS or all these different places. The reality is that our retail shopping habits is already being used by pharmaceutical benefit managers that are now connected to healthcare retailers, to price drugs and sometimes health insurance in certain ways. So forgive me for going on, but it's already happening.
That's a great point. It is already happening, and the insurance commissions in a lot of states are behind this. But I remember hearing a TED Talk in 2018, and the the speaker was talking about how insurance companies for life insurance were actually scouring the social media platforms of the applicants to see whether they engage in certain kinds of behaviors. Like, for example, you go on Instagram and there are a bunch of pictures of you hang gliding, to take an example. And so they're already using publicly available data to underwrite against their risks. And today, you've got people who've never had a loss who are getting non-renewed because the algorithm is saying that based on our data, you're at a higher risk for loss on your policy, even though there's no history of this. So to Sarah's point, it's already out there. And the question is, are we going to be able to pull back? And my sense is that probably not.
Okay, and on that note, I've got 2 questions for you, and I'll just go one by one. First is, should we have control over who has our data? This is a personal opinion. Okay, Renee says yes. Felix?
Yes.
Sarah, should we have control over
Yes.
who has our data?
She said yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. All right. And what's one big change that you kind of see that could be coming 5-10 years from now that we just currently don't have when it comes to health data and privacy?
I'll get us started really quick. I think there's going to be technology that is going to be developed that is going to help us safeguard our privacy. And you already see that in security built into chips, just as an example. So I think you're going to see technology, what I call privacy tech, that's going to take off.
Okay. Felix, I can see you.
Yeah, I completely agree. Right now, it's actually, there's a process in the cloud that safeguards it, but it is done by software engineers, by cybersecurity analysts and folks trained in that area. But I completely agree. It will be automated in the near future. So it is going to be by default safeguarded.
And Sarah, 5-10 years out. Well, what do you see?
I'd say 2 things. One, I think that more and more companies are going to use what's referred to as synthetic data, right? So think of that as representative data. So maybe they take my name and my sort of very clearly identifiable information out of the profile they have on me, and they anonymize most of those elements and then put me in a bigger group of people, almost like a statistic. So I think that is going to be significantly more used as kind of an end run around some of the privacy challenges that companies, no matter how challenging this area is, some of them are trying to do their best, and so I think they're gonna use that more. And I also think parliamentary systems around the world are gonna pivot more towards this code level audit framework of enforcement, and also of guidance of what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. That's what I would guess is going to be the direction.
Fantastic. You know, I cannot thank you enough. You have been 3 amazing, really amazing panelists to have. And I personally found this incredibly thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed this. And I hope our audience also found this enjoyable and insightful. So I want to thank our event co-sponsors, again, the Harvard W3D, IEEE, and Harvard Alumni Entrepreneurs. Please reach out to them. We are all here as nonprofits that are on a mission of alignment to educate and improve the world. So, if you have an opportunity, get involved, become an advocate. There are plenty of places you can become much more engaged if you really care about privacy and cybersecurity. We're going to continue our conversation on personal privacy and cybersecurity at an event in the fall. We're going to be talking about the huge new threat, which is misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And on that note, I just want to thank our panelists again, thank our sponsors, and we hope that you'll take a look at your personal privacy in a new light and take whatever steps necessary to protect yourself. So on that note, I say thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thanks all.